This is a Fox News alert. President Trump has just finished speaking to the Heritage Foundation in Washington, where he promoted a Republican plan to reform America's tax code. Good evening. Welcome to Tucker Carlson tonight. In just a minute, we'll talk about a meeting at the Weinstein Company in Los Angeles today. Harvey was part of that. Also, there's new information about the Las Vegas security guard who apparently vanished into thin air, one of the rare eyewitnesses from inside the hotel. The latest on that. But first, here's part of what the president just said about his tax plan.
Our framework provides a one-time low tax on profits currently sitting offshore so that this money can come back right where it started, come back home to America where it belongs. And believe me, we can use it in this country. We need it so badly for so many things, including infrastructure, which we'll also be doing. We will eliminate the penalty on bringing home, and we have to do that, future earnings. My Council of Economic Advisors estimates that this change, along with a lower business tax rate, would likely give the typical American household around a $4,000 pay raise. And that's money that'll be spent in our economy. Our tax plan will ensure that companies stay in America, grow in America, and hire in America.
Well, for reaction to the president's address and his tax plan, we're joined tonight by Fox chief political analyst Brit Hume. Brit, thanks for joining us. It seems like taxes may be the last issue that most Republicans in the Congress can agree on. They're all for tax cuts. That's part of what it is to be a Republican, I think. Is there any way that this doesn't pass?
Well, you've got a very narrow majority in the Senate. There are benefits in this tax code now that would have to be stricken to make room for the cuts, so you don't have a big blowout in terms of the budget. And they will be fiercely supported and defended by those affected. So they'll be, it won't be easy, not with a narrow majority of the kind that we have now among Republicans. Democrats, by and large, do not favor tax cuts, particularly tax cuts that they will inevitably say benefit the rich. And it's not that easy a sell, Tucker, for this reason. For one thing, every time you pass tax cuts, and you heard the president tonight say, they're going to increase the number of people in the zero bracket. You have fewer and fewer people actually paying taxes. Right. That is to say, fewer and people who stand to gain when taxes are cut, because it is simply a mathematical truism that when you cut taxes, the people who benefit are the people who pay taxes. And as that population shrinks, the constituency for tax cuts shrinks with it. So this is not such an easy deal. I would say, however, that there's momentum provided by a certain Republican desperation to get something big done because they failed so spectacularly on Obamacare repeal. And this is the other big ticket legislative item. And I think there's a widespread feeling in the Republican caucus in both houses that they need to get this done.
So the debate among Republicans, I think, outside of the Congress is, does this make good on the president's promises to his core constituency, the American middle class, during the campaign? Will this, from what you can tell so far, benefit that group, middle-class Americans? Well,
there are two ways to look at tax cut benefits, Tucker. There's the indirect kind of benefit where you pay a certain amount of taxes this year, and because the new law comes along, your taxes will be reduced by X amount. That's right. One way you benefit. The principal purpose of a large tax cut of this kind, especially where you're also cutting the corporate rate, is not just to put money in the pockets of consumers to spend it. It is to encourage investment and growth in the economy, which benefits everybody. And I think it's fair to say, Tucker, that the principal benefits, the major benefits, the most important benefit in economic terms of a big tax cut is to stimulate the economy, so people benefit indirectly. That is to say, jobs are created, there's competition for hiring, wages go up. And there really is a possibility of a rising tide that does lift all boats. But when you're selling a tax cut, as you could tell by what the president was saying tonight, you often have to focus on the narrower question of how much does this constituent or that constituent get in savings.
Do you think that ordinary Republicans still believe that a rising tide lifts all boats? because certain votes have.
You mean ordinary
been lifted.
Republican voters?
Yes, ordinary Republican voters who voted for Trump, who was a departure
right.
in what he said on the campaign from the classic Republican orthodoxy on economics. You got the sense that there were a lot of crossover voters who had supported Bernie Sanders and voted for Trump. I wonder if the view among ordinary Republicans is different from the view from Washington on this.
Look, I think that by and large, broadly speaking, tax cuts tend to be popular.
Yeah.
Even Democratic voters would like to have their taxes cut. Everybody wants their taxes cut. And when you consider the growth of the federal income tax over the years, most people think they pay too much. Although, as I pointed out earlier, Tucker, there are a lot of people who are paying very little in federal income taxes. They pay Social Security taxes, they pay state and local taxes, and so on. So everybody has taxes that they would like to see cut. So I think the constituency for it is still there. The constituency for the kind of tax cuts that the president is selling, where you're reducing the rates, where you can point to people and say, look at this guy, he's got all this, he's going to get millions in benefits. Well, that's because he pays so much. But we live in a country, after all, where 10% of the population, the richer 10%, pay about 70% of the taxes. It figures that when taxes are cut, they're going to benefit the most because they pay the most. That is not a particularly good selling point to an ordinary taxpayer.
No, but that is math. Britt Hume, thank you.
You bet, Tucker.
Art Laffer, one of the most famous economists in the world. He worked in the Reagan administration during the last great overhaul of the American tax code. President Trump just tweeted about Art Laffer, saying, quote, Art Laffer just said he doesn't know how a Democrat could vote against the big tax cut reform bill and live with themselves. Art Laffer joins us tonight. We know he agrees with that. Art, thanks a lot for coming on.
Thank you, Tucker. I watch your show all the time. I love it.
Well, thank you. So the central question, I think, of the last couple of years, certainly the one that drove the last election, is what do you do about a middle class that is getting smaller and poorer, whose wages haven't risen, in a lot of cases, in 50 years? Does this help? Specifically, does it help them?
Oh, this helps a lot. I mean, what I think the president said is correct. It's Kevin Hassett's research. But, the corporate tax rate reduction expands wages and it expands employment dramatically. Most economists agree that the real key to getting economic growth is bringing that corporate rate down from 35%, hopefully to 15%, but 20% is where they propose it now. But that should be an enormous elixir to economic growth and create jobs and, literally get people off the dole and put them on the jobs and raise wages and increase the number of people working. It'll be a great thing for the U.S.
Judging by the equities markets, corporations are making a lot of money. It's not, the problem is not corporate profits, and yet you still have, close to 100 million Americans unemployed in these stagnant wages. Why, if that hasn't worked previously, would it work now?
Well, one thing is the corporations that have lots of cash on hand and all that don't find it valuable to invest in the future. They invest overseas, they do overseas, but once you bring that rate down to below we're #1 highest tax rate, corporate tax rate in the OECD. Right. That means all these other countries are tax havens for American companies, and that's why there's so much money abroad. This money will come back, they'll create jobs here, and hopefully if we get it low enough, Tucker, we can become the tax haven and their jobs will come here. It'll be great, just the way it should be, just the way we did it in 1986. The president cut the highest rate from 46% to 34%. And that really rocket engined the U.S. economy. And by the way, when we did that, 97 senators voted for that bill, including all but 3 Democrats. So, this is a bipartisan policy that should lead to enormous economic growth and prosperity for the middle class.
Did the Bush tax cuts work?
Very slightly, but yes, they did work a little bit. A couple of them did, but they phased them in over a long period of time, and they weren't anything like I would like to have seen, but they did work a little bit. And then the second term of Bush completely overturned that, and it was a terrible administration in the second term. And then, of course, you had Obama, who, destroyed a lot of the good economic prosperity.
And a financial collapse as well. So,
it was terrible in the whole thing, yes.
Yeah, it was. It sure was. And the recovery is not complete. Far from it. So what would happen?
I mean, we're really low, Tucker. I mean, we're way below where we should be. If we had the same employment to population ratio today, we'd have 11.8 million more jobs if we had the same employment to population as when Clinton left office.
Well, exactly. So the president's plan to encourage companies to bring that money back on shore, if that were to remain part of this bill and it passes and becomes law, how much are we talking about coming back in the United States?
Well, I don't know what the exact numbers would be, but it'd be a lot. Let me just say that if we had territoriality before, none of it would have left the U.S. I mean, what territoriality means is that if you pay foreign taxes, you don't own any additional U.S. taxes. Trump was very clear on that in his speech, and he's just proposed territoriality as opposed to you're liable for U.S. taxes as well as foreign taxes. That doesn't make any sense at all. We can't compete with a German company in Ireland if they pay 12.5% and we have to pay 35%.
Is the United States the only country that does that?
We're the only one in the OECD that does that. There may be some other little country somewhere, but in the OECD of all the major countries, we were the only country that had global taxation. We had the highest tax rate. And just for the record, just so you know, in the year 2000, the U.S. was 7th highest out of 34 countries in the OECD, and now it is the very highest. Every country in the OECD cut their corporate tax rates dramatically in the last 17 years, except the U.S. and, of course, Hungary, which raised their tax rate from 18% to 19%. But so all of them lowered it to get it more competitive. We're just keeping up with the Joneses.
Really quickly, when I was born, 1969, this country was 2/3 middle class. It was a middle class country. 2 years ago, the middle class became the minority in this country. That seems like the central problem. Do you sincerely think that this tax plan would help change that?
Yes. This tax plan will help change this. One of the things about the corporate tax as it stands now in the U.S., Tucker, is that a lot of companies shelter their income. They choose different corporate tax forms. They do all of this other stuff that is non-productive, trying to get around taxes.
Right.
When we lower that tax rate, they won't shelter their income as much anymore. There'll be far less tax evasion. They won't choose these forms. Companies will come back. And you know what you're going to see? You're going to see tax revenues rise dramatically over the next 10 years. I'm estimating that this will raise somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.3 trillion net, which will allow us to do all sorts of other things for the rest of the country, especially the middle class, Tucker.
Boy, I hope that's true. I'm rooting for that, I got to say. Art Laffer, thank you for that.
Thank you.
Great to see you. Is this the end of the Weinstein Company? New information on today's board meeting. Apparently, Harvey Weinstein there. Details next. Harvey Weinstein is gone. The disgraced studio mogul resigned from the Weinstein Company today, confirming his unofficial ouster last week. The scandal grows, though. According to Variety, Weinstein's brother Bob is now facing his own accusations of sexual harassment. Chris Spargo is a reporter at thedailymail.com. He's been covering this story extensively, and he joins us tonight. Chris, his brother is now being accused?
That's right. Right after the board meeting this morning, new allegations came out that Bob Weinstein, apparently in 2016, had over the course of 3 months very aggressively pursued a producer on one of his shows, The Mist, which is on Spike TV, took her to dinner, then afterwards suggested they maybe go to his hotel room. She claims that she very firmly denied this offer. She said she didn't want anything more than a professional relationship, but still allegedly pursued this relationship, emailed her relentlessly, tried to get her to go alone to his house in Malibu at some point. And after 3 months of this, she claims that she had to get her lawyer to contact the Weinstein Company and ask them to have him stop.
Yeah, it's a bad sign when the lawyer gets involved. What's the claim count on this story so far? Do you have any sense of how many women have come forward to allege abuse?
It has really gotten out of control at this point, but we do know for sure at this point that the number of women making allegations of assault and or harassment is over 50 right now.
Over 50. So, I mean, does each one represent a legal action, do you think?
It depends on the state, of course. In some places there's a statute, some places there aren't. We do know that in New York there are currently probes into 2 allegations of sexual assault against Mr. Weinstein. One of the women who shared her stories in the New Yorker, and another woman whose identity we do not know at this time.
And those would be criminal probes by the state?
Those would indeed, yes.
Huh, interesting. So Harvey Weinstein is or is no longer affiliated with his company? So
this is where it's a little bit tricky. So after all this talk of him really wanting to go in today and fight for his position, we learned that he resigned, but he does still have a 23% stake in the company. So it remains to be seen what's going to happen with that. Obviously, many directors and actors have been very firm about the fact they have no desire to work with him. So if the company is going to be bought, it would seem he'd have to be bought out by whoever decides to come in, because no one is going to do anything that's going to profit him.
So when this story broke a couple of weeks ago, Lisa Bloom was center stage representing Harvey Weinstein and basically making assurances that everything is fine, it's cool. When it got out of control, she fled the scene. Has she reemerged? Have you seen her recently, or is she in hiding?
She actually was with Black China, one of her former clients last night, Rob Kardashian's estranged girlfriend. But she's just sort of returned to her typical thing and tried to sort of distance herself from this as much as possible, which is what every lawyer and spokesperson who's been involved in it for the most part for the past 2 weeks has done. The company itself is without a spokesperson currently. You have to actually call their office to speak to someone.
Except in contrast, I think with most lawyers, Lisa Bloom has been accused of, in effect, bribery by Rose McGowan, who said she offered her some huge number of dollars, $6 million, to change her story on Harvey Weinstein. Any movement on that story?
Yeah, Rose McGowan. And Rose McGowan is not the only one. There was also a report yesterday that one of the profiteers of a club where an alleged assault took place was called by lawyers for Weinstein and asked if he could sort of go on the record and say that this had never happened. So it seems that this might be a new story coming to light where multiple people were contacted about keeping quiet or denying claims that were being made by victims.
Yeah, I mean, it's like if you think Harvey Weinstein was sleazy, wait till you meet his lawyers. Yeah. I mean, they're really unbelievable. Are there potential criminal penalties attached to that? I mean, are you allowed to encourage people to change their story in exchange for money?
It depends. I think that it would happen to, you know, someone who actually accepted that payout, which, again, this is all developing and it's sort of unbelievable with each new thing we learn. So there's a very real sort of feeling that this might get into the point where someone is going to get charged who was representing Weinstein.
Yeah, that would not surprise me at all. We'll be watching carefully. Chris, thanks a lot for that.
Thanks for having me.
A new report from the Hill newspaper says that the FBI has uncovered evidence of a major Russian bribery effort just before the Obama administration's approval of a deal back in 2010 that gave Russia control over large amounts of American uranium. Why would the Obama administration give Russia control over that? Great question. To answer that and others, we've invited Fox Chief National Correspondent Ed Henry, who has the very latest. Hey, Ed.
Tucker, good to see you. This is a major exclusive from the Hill newspaper because it's raising new questions about just what kind of relationship the Obamas and the Clintons had with the Russians amid all of these other investigations going on right now here in Washington about the Trump campaign and alleged Russian collusion. The Hill exclusive goes back, as you say, to 2010 when the Obama administration approved a controversial deal to give Moscow control of a majority of a big chunk of, I should say, American uranium. And what they have in this report is that the FBI was actually investigating in 2002, 2009, 2010, the fact that money was pouring into the U.S. from Russian sources, Russian nuclear industry officials, kickbacks, all kinds of money, all kinds of problems. And they say in this report, quote, federal agents obtained an eyewitness account backed by documents indicating Russian nuclear officials had routed millions of dollars to the U.S. designed to benefit former President Bill Clinton's charitable foundation during the time Secretary of State Hillary Clinton served on a government body that provided a favorable decision to Moscow. Obviously, she was running the State Department at the time. It was a panel within that department that was deciding this. The story goes on to say the Obama administration and the Clintons defended their actions at the time, insisting there was no evidence that any Russians or donors engaged in wrongdoing, and there was no national security reason for any member of the committee to oppose this Uranium One deal. But FBI, Energy Department, and court documents reviewed by the Hill newspaper show the FBI, in fact, had gathered substantial evidence well before the committee's decision that Vadim Milkarin, the main Russian overseeing Vladimir Putin's nuclear expansion inside the U.S., was engaged in wrongdoing starting in 2009. What's interesting is that the Justice Department began investigating this 2009, 2010, investigated it for 4 years, but obviously we've never seen anyone charged from all of this. And which Justice Department was investigating this, of course? The Obama Justice Department, investigating Obama officials like Hillary Clinton. Remember, Peter Schweitzer, the author of Clinton Cash, raised some of these questions in the last campaign. Then candidate Donald Trump, jumped on it, if you will. And at the time, a spokesman for Hillary Clinton's campaign was saying she was not actively engaged on this panel, was not involved in the decision involving uranium. But obviously these questions were raised, and now it's interesting that the FBI maybe had evidence of Russian.
Ed Henry, he was joining us from the White House and unfortunately lost the connection. It's an amazing story, though. They always accuse you of what they're doing themselves. Well, there's even more news about Hillary Clinton tonight. A search of Anthony Weiner's laptop has uncovered new files from Huma Abedin. We've got details on that coming up. Looks like former Congressman Anthony Weiner will be headed to prison soon, but the saga of Anthony Weiner continues. The FBI now says it found thousands of Huma Abedin's files on Weiner's confiscated laptop computer and will release all of them by the end of the year. Tom Fitton is the president of Judicial Watch. His lawsuit against the State Department caused those documents to come to light, and he joins us tonight to explain what they mean. Tom, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Tucker.
I'm sorry to superimpose you against a picture of Anthony Weiner's chest. What's the significance of these documents?
Well, they're new documents. We don't know what's in them yet, but Huma Abedin had an email account on Hillary Clinton's server. So these are emails from Hillary Clinton's server that were on Anthony Weiner's laptop. And the FBI picked them up last year, the end of last year. Remember, Mr. Comey was yelled at for highlighting the fact they found this information that they needed to evaluate. Well, it turns out they had nearly 3,000 government records on Weiner's laptop. And now we're going to get access to them by the end of the year. We don't know what's releasable to us.
And they were government records?
Yeah, they were government records. The government acknowledged that. And based on the other Abedin emails that we have, which involve pay-to-play, classified information, Hillary Clinton emails that we hadn't seen before, that she didn't turn over and tried to delete, I suspect there's going to be classified material among this, these new records. So this is another example of top government officials like Huma Abedin and Hillary Clinton having classified materials in places they weren't allowed to, which are violations of criminal law, despite Mr. Comey's opinions to the contrary.
And moreover, when we spent the last year talking about Russian hacking, I mean, clearly it's not safe to keep government data on a private computer. The larger question, though, is why are we learning about this now?
Well, it took them that forever to get them to us.
But why? I mean, I thought we had a freedom of information law that requires the government to be responsible.
Well, the only reason we're getting this information is we're in court about it. And we demanded access to the information because we wanted Abedin's government emails from this secret account. And the FBI found these records last year. They took forever to turn them over to the State Department. The State Department got them last June.
Wait, but do these documents belong to the FBI or do they belong to the American people?
Well, the FBI found them, and they found that they were State Department records.
Right.
They turned them over to the State Department many months ago, and now we're finally learning the analysis has been done because there are records that we won't get because they may be actually personal records of Ms. Abedin or Weiner, whoever. So, but we now know there are 3,000 government records that we want to.
It just seems like I hear the same story all the time. The government has a legal requirement to turn over non-classified documents when citizens request it, when journalists request it, groups like yours request it, and they don't again and again. How do they get around that law?
Well, they ignore it, and you just have to push in the courts for it. And this, to me, is an opportunity for President Trump to kind of initiate a transparency revolution by getting this information out as quickly as possible. We know the FBI went and found the emails that Mrs. Clinton tried to delete. And they found some of them or recovered them. The State Department has them. We don't know when we're going to get those. At the current schedule, the State Department wants to release all of Mrs. Clinton's emails to us that they still have and haven't released at a rate that would make them, at a rate that would allow us to finally get them all in the year 2020.
So there are still thousands of documents being withheld from the Kennedy assassination over 50 years ago, and the CIA is now arguing, we're going to do a story on this tomorrow, that they need to hold them for another 25 years. If people knew the amount of information that belongs to them being held by government bureaucrats and officials, they would freak out, I think.
I think we sued over that, too.
Oh, good for you. Tom Fitton, great to see you.
Thank you, Tucker.
You're doing the Lord's work. It's been 49 weeks and counting since the 2016 election. The hunt is still on for proof of Russian meddling. Did Putin get Trump elected? We still don't know. We did recently speak, though, to progressive journalist Glenn Greenwald, who said the press is replacing good reporting with inaccurate scandal mongering. Watch this. So, Glenn, just to get to the facts of this story, it is conclusively shown that the story about the 21 voting systems being hacked is untrue, correct?
It's false in two ways. One is that several of the states included in the list, such as Wisconsin, California, and Texas, said that the websites that the Homeland Security Department cited have nothing to do with voting systems. They're entirely unrelated. And it's false in a second way, which is a lot of the stories, in fact, most of them said that Russia tried to hack into the voting systems, when in fact, even Homeland Security, it can only show that what they did was scan those computer systems, which is basically casing something to see for vulnerabilities, and made no attempts to actually hack into them. So it was false on various levels.
So you and I don't agree on a lot of issues, but I think we share the same concern about this story, and that is that American journalists are being manipulated for whatever reason by the intelligence community in the United States. And I'm wondering why, after years of having this happen to American journalists, they're allowing this to happen again.
Well, that's the thing. I would reframe that a little bit. I don't actually think so much that journalists are the victims in the sense of that formulation, that they're being manipulated. I think at best what you can say for them is they're willingly and eagerly being manipulated. Because what you see is over and over they publish really inflammatory stories that turn out to be totally false. And what happens in those cases? Nothing. They get enormous benefits when they publish recklessly. They get applause on social media from their peers. They get zillions of retweets, huge amounts of traffic. They end up on TV. They get applauded across the spectrum because people are so giddy and eager to hear more about this Russia and Trump story. And when their stories get completely debunked, it just kind of everybody agrees to ignore it, and everyone moves on and they pay no price. At the same time, they're feeding and pleasing their sources by publishing these stories that their sources want them to publish. And so there's huge amounts of career benefits and reputational benefits and very little cost when they publish stories that end up being debunked because the narrative they're serving is a popular one, at least within their peer circles.
Gosh, that's so dishonest. I mean, I think all of us in journalism have gotten things wrong. I certainly have. And you feel bad about it. I mean, you really do. And there's a consequence. You really think there's that level of dishonesty in the American press?
I think what it is more than dishonesty is a really warped incentive scheme bolstered by this very severe groupthink that social media is fostering in ways that we don't yet fully understand.
Yes.
Most journalists these days aren't in congressional committees or at zoning board meetings or using shoe letter reporting. They're sitting on Twitter talking to one another. And this produces this extreme groupthink where these orthodoxies arise, and deviating from them or questioning them or challenging, believe me, results in all kinds of recrimination and scorn. And embracing them produces this sort of in-group mentality where you're rewarded. And I think a lot of it is about that kind of behavior.
That is really deep. I mean, you live in a foreign country. I'm not on social media. So maybe we've got a little bit of distance from this. Where do you think this story is going? What's the next incarnation of it?
Well, the odd part about it, and about the impatience that journalists have in trying to just jump to the finish line, is that there are numerous investigations underway in the city, including by credible investigators, including Senator Burr and Warner and the Senate Intelligence Committee, which most people seem to trust, and certainly Robert Mueller, who's armed with subpoena power, and everyone is really eager to lavish with praise. So we're going to find out, presumably one way or the other, soon enough. I guess the one thing that's so odd to me, Tucker, is that this has been going on now for a year, this accusation that the Trump administration or the Trump campaign colluded with the Russians to hack the DNC and John Podesta's email. And we know that there are huge numbers of people inside the government who are willing to leak, even at the expense of committing crimes, in order to undermine Trump. And yet there's been no leak so far showing any evidence of that kind of collusion, leading one to wonder why that is. So I hope that everybody's willing to wait until the actual investigation reveals finally the real answer answers, but it doesn't seem that will be the case.
Bravery is when you disagree in public with your peers, and by that definition, you are a very brave man. Glenn Greenwald, thanks for joining us tonight. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Tucker.
The drug epidemic in this country killed more people in the last 12 months than the entire 11 years of the Vietnam War. What is Congress doing? Is Congress making it worse? Our series Drugged is back. That's next. America, unfortunately, is losing the war against drugs, and overdoses are the evidence of that. According to new CDC numbers, drug ODs killed 62,000 Americans just last year. That's more than died during the entire Vietnam War. The biggest driver of those deaths is growing addiction to opioid painkillers and the street alternatives such as heroin and fentanyl. It's one of the greatest crises in American history, and yet Congress seems mostly oblivious to it, at best slow and indecisive. Could Big Pharma's lobbying efforts be a reason why? That's a rhetorical question. The answer, of course, is yes. Matt Murphy was once chief of pharmaceutical investigations for the DEA. He's now president of Pharma Compliance Group. Matt Murphy joins us tonight. Matt, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Tucker. It's a pleasure to be with you tonight.
So those numbers are they're almost hard to believe. Over 60,000 Americans dead in 1 year of drug OD. What should the Congress be doing?
Well, they shouldn't be enacting laws that take the authority away from the Drug Enforcement Administration. They should be enacting laws that provide resources to law enforcement to target and dismantle organizations, criminal organizations that are distributing these prescription drugs throughout the country.
Yes. When you were working for the DEA and seeing this crisis unfold in real time, did it surprise you that policymakers seem mostly unaware of it or not panicked by it, not upset?
It did. Yeah, it surprised me quite a bit, actually, that politicians didn't get behind law enforcement efforts until this problem was well down the road. And, it became what's now known as an epidemic. It didn't happen overnight. There are stories written every day, folks like yourself that are articulating the issues out there that are happening in the country as it pertains to the misuse and abuse of prescription drugs. So, yeah, it did surprise me.
So you'd read these stories, or you'd hear stories about pill mills, particularly in the state of Florida, in others to Kentucky, where people could just walk in and walk out with a script for an addictive opioid painkiller. I've never understood, why weren't those places shut down immediately? Obviously, DEA knew about them.
Yeah. Well, there were, many of them were shut down, and people were prosecuted and went to jail that owned and operated those, which you refer to as pill mills, which is appropriate. But this problem started before pill mills. Pill mills were a reaction to when we shut down internet pharmacies.
Right.
And there wasn't any law at the time that prevented a person from taking a credit card and going online and Googling hydrocodone without a prescription, and hundreds of websites would pop up, and they could order Vicodin or hydrocodone online, which is the brand name for that is Vicodin, and that would be shipped to their house by a parcel carrier, and the person who ordered the drugs would never have to leave the house.
Right.
So the Ryan-Haight Act legislation was passed, and that mandated at least one face-to-face doctor-patient visit before a prescription for a controlled substance could be issued. And that was a case of where the technology got ahead of the law, and subsequently the law did catch up. And when the internet pharmacies domestically were put out of business, the pain management clinics popped up because the pill mills had a doctor on site. And there'd be lines out the door, security guards with...
Of course, but what I've never understood is the online pharmacies and the pill mills don't manufacture these drugs. They're manufactured by pharma companies like Purdue Pharma. Didn't they notice that their drugs were being sold illicitly?
Of course they did. Manufacturers as well as the distributors, they know where every dosage unit of every medication that they either manufacture or distribute, whose shelf it ends up on at the end of the day. So of course they knew where their pills ended up, and they know if that town or geographic region can support the amount of pills that are being distributed to those areas. But that being said, Tucker, I want your viewers to understand something else about this problem that's very comprehensive and complex. There are practitioners and there are pharmacists that have a corresponding responsibility to ensure that every prescription they write for practitioners and fill for pharmacists are written for a legitimate medical purpose. And if they're not written for a legitimate medical purpose, like there's a doctor in the neighborhood who's writing the same prescription for everybody that comes in the door, they shouldn't be filling those prescriptions, and the doctor shouldn't be writing those prescriptions.
They should be punished because it's a violation of decency, among other things. Matt, thank you for all your efforts to hold people like that to account. It's disgusting.
Oh, thank you.
Two big mysteries dominate the news today, as they have for the past week. Why did so-called feminist lawyer Lisa Bloom help Harvey Weinstein? What was she being paid for that? And new reports that the vanishing Las Vegas guard may have used a stranger's Social Security number to work at Mandalay Bay. New details on both of those coming up. There's at least one great mystery at the heart of the Harvey Weinstein scandal. Why did so many vocally liberal, supposedly pro-women individuals assertively cover for his behavior? Lisa Bloom is example A. She made a career as a champion of women who faced sexism and sexual assault. Lisa Bloom is now accused of offering to bribe one of Weinstein's accusers, someone who accused him of rape, bribe her to change her tune. How'd that happen? Tammy Bruce is a radio show host, and she joins us now to unravel this, among other mysteries. Tammy, what is this about?
Yeah, look, this is something that we've been hearing about. Rose McGowan is clearly an actress and one of the heroes of this story. Ms. McGowan is alleging that during this, just as before the New York Times profile expose on Mr. Weinstein was going to be released, Ms. McGowan alleges that Lisa Bloom contacted her literary agent and said that there could be a lot of money for her if she would get on the Harvey Has Changed bandwagon. Now, this is from an assertion from Ms. McGowan saying at first they offered $1 million and then they got up to $6 million. And Ms. McGowan says, I can't be bought. I mean, that's obviously a lot of money. It would change people's lives, of course. But she went on, she publicly talked to Ms. Bloom through Twitter and I think her Facebook, saying, you know, we know who you are now. You've betrayed individuals. You tried to bribe me to do this. Lisa Bloom, keep in mind, has denied any of that occurred. Yes. But what we also know is, while she was representing Harvey Weinstein, well, she says that was a mistake. She had no idea how bad it was. But at the same time, she was also on the defense team for Roy Price, the now disgraced head of Amazon Studios, who has been indefinitely suspended for a sexual harassment case. In that case, Ms. Bloom is accused by Kim Masters, a very well-respected journalist, of threatening her effectively with lawsuits, which is what lawyers do, but also saying that she would be exposed for doing this to Mr. Price because Amazon wouldn't fund a radio program that she had, which Ms. Masters says is completely false, and yet is somewhat ironic since Ms. Bloom had a business deal for a miniseries with Harvey Weinstein. So you've got this interesting attempt in both cases to either silence women through money or to threaten them with it. Yeah.
And to profit from it herself in the process. I mean, if that's not the definition of corruption, I don't know what is. But it's not our only mystery for you tonight. Las Vegas, shrouded in mysteries, getting more confusing by the day. The Mandalay security guard, Jesus Campos, was, as you know, all set to talk to the media, including Sean Hannity, last Thursday, and then canceled, and then apparently disappeared. Now, MGM Reports appears to be issuing statements on his behalf, somehow, requesting privacy. Meanwhile, cops still can't find a motive for Stephen Paddock's rampage. And we're learning that Campos may have used someone else's federal ID. What does this add up to, if anything? Can you make heads or tails of this story?
Yeah, look, his union, when he first bailed on a series of interviews, said, we don't know where he is. He's just disappeared. And then his union leader said, well, we got a text that he went to an urgent center, and now he's really disappeared. We don't know where he is. And this is what's troubling, is that there's already a lack of trust from the American people from big government.
That's right.
And we've got fake news, and we've got conspiracy theories. And here you've got a man who is effectively the only eyewitness in the moment on the floor, and he was shot. He was shot in the thigh, a security guard. And we now know, for a period of time, we didn't know where he was, but now MGM, his employer, is saying, well, we know where he is. He wants privacy. whereas his union before said he wants to speak to people and let them know what he knows. So at this point, we have this major witness. We don't know where he is. The law enforcement is not speaking about anything at this point. And the American people are hearing so many different stories. This is what adds into and creates some fake news. It can encourage conspiracy theorists. But what what we'd hope for, of course, is that the FBI should have more of a handle on this.
Well, yeah.
And whether or not he's an illegal alien, look, at this point, this transcends his status, and we have a responsibility to let him know that.
There's a report. It does transcend that. I think that's right. But there's a report finally that he used someone else's social security number. Is that? Yeah. Do we know that?
Well, see, this is it. All of this once again moves into gossip. And we have no transparency. But this is also not a debated environment. We know exactly what happened. We know who did it in the moment. You notice who else is out of the news is the girlfriend. When was the last time you heard about the status of the woman whose information he allegedly used to get into the hotel, and in some ways that he used it in some fashion for some purchases?
That's right.
And the American people, it's important that we know, because we're told by the government all the time that they know what's best and that we have to follow their rules. And they're not telling us the story.
Look, I don't know what's going on, but I got a pretty good nose for BS. I know something's going on, for sure. Tammy, thank you.
Thank you, Tucker.